I didn't expect to see him again. Not like this. Not in a room full of white roses and champagne flutes, with jazz playing softly through hidden speakers and laughter rising in careful, elegant waves. I came to this rehearsal dinner because a friend asked me to, because I was tired of saying no to everything, because I thought maybe it was time to rejoin the world, even if only for a weekend. I stood near the bar, nursing a glass of red wine I hadn't asked for, watching strangers congratulate each other on love and commitment and all the things people say when they believe in forever. The room smelled like expensive perfume and lilies. Everything was tastefully lit, carefully curated, the kind of event where even the napkins had been chosen with intention. I felt out of place in my rented suit, but no one seemed to notice. I was just another guest filling a seat, balancing the numbers. And then Malcolm Reyes walked in. I saw him before he saw me. He came through the main entrance with that same easy confidence he'd always carried, the kind that made people turn and look without quite knowing why. 10 years had passed since I'd last seen him, but I recognized him instantly. The same dark hair, though shorter now, more controlled. The same broad shoulders beneath a perfectly tailored jacket. The same mouth I used to know by heart. He was laughing at something someone had said, his head tilted back slightly, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. I set my wine glass down on the nearest table because my hand had started to shake. This wasn't possible. This wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't know Wesley, the groom, well enough to anticipate this. I didn't know anything about his life, his friends, his history. I came here as a favor, a last-minute replacement, someone to fill an empty chair. Malcolm scanned the room the way people do when they're looking for someone specific, his eyes moving across faces with casual efficiency. And then his gaze landed on me. I watched the recognition hit him, watched his expression shift from polite interest to something I couldn't quite name. Shock, maybe, or fear. The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might actually be sick. His hand tightened around a champagne flute he was holding, knuckles going white against the glass. We stood there, separated by maybe 30 feet in a decade of silence, staring at each other across a room full of people who had no idea what was happening. The music continued. Conversations flowed around us. Someone laughed too loudly near the appetizer table. But between us, everything had gone still. I should have looked away, should have turned and walked out the nearest exit, found my car, driven back to my quiet life upstate where nothing unexpected ever happened. But I didn't move. I just watched him, this ghost from my past who'd walked back into my present without warning, without permission. Malcolm broke first. He said something to the person beside him, forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and then excused himself. I watched him move through the crowd with practiced ease, watched him slip through a side door that led away from the main ballroom. He didn't look back. I waited 30 seconds, maybe a minute, long enough to seem like coincidence if anyone was paying attention. Then I followed. The hallway beyond the ballroom was quiet, almost shockingly so after the noise of the party. Soft carpet absorbed my footsteps. Wall sconces cast gentle light across cream-colored walls. Malcolm stood about 20 feet away, his back to me, one hand pressed against the wall like he needed it for support. I said nothing, just stood there, giving him time to decide what came next. He turned slowly, and when he looked at me, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't expected. Not anger, not even surprise anymore, just exhaustion, like seeing me had taken something fundamental out of him. We stood there in silence. The jazz from the ballroom was muffled here, barely audible. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. But between us, there was only history. 10 years of it, heavy and unspoken, filling the space like smoke. Finally, Malcolm spoke. His voice came out low and strained, barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" It was such a simple question, such an obvious one. But the way he asked it made it sound like an accusation or maybe a plea. Like my presence here was somehow a betrayal, an intrusion into a life he'd carefully constructed without me. I could have told him the truth, that I didn't know he'd be here, that this was an accident, a cosmic joke, the universe's cruelest sense of timing, that I'd spent 10 years rebuilding myself after he left, creating a life so quiet and controlled that nothing could hurt me again. that I'd said yes to this wedding weekend because I was trying, finally, to be someone who showed up, someone who participated, someone who wasn't still hiding from everything that reminded him of love. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I just looked at him, at this man who'd once known every part of me, who'd held my secrets like they were sacred, who'd promised me things in the dark that he took back in the daylight. I looked at him and felt everything I'd buried rise up in my chest, sharp and insistent. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He looked like he wanted to say more, or maybe like he wanted to run. His hand dropped from the wall, and he straightened, pulling himself together with visible effort. I could see him putting on a mask again, the one he'd always worn so well. The one that said everything was fine, everything was exactly as it should be. But his eyes gave him away. They always had. I took a step forward, then another, until we were close enough that I could smell his cologne, something woody and expensive that I didn't recognize. Everything about him was different now, carefully chosen, meticulously maintained. Everything except the way he was looking at me. Like I was a door he'd thought he'd locked forever, and somehow, impossibly, I'd opened again. My life had become something I could control. That was the point of it, really. The whole careful architecture I'd built over the years, piece by piece, in the small town upstate where nobody knew me and nobody asked questions I didn't want to answer. I restore antique furniture. It's solitary work, the kind that requires patience and precision and an understanding that some things, once broken, can be made whole again if you're willing to put in the time. I work with my hands. I sand and stain and repair. I bring back the grain and wood that's been painted over, buried under layers of someone else's vision. There's something honest about it, something that makes sense in a way people never quite do. My workshop sits on the ground floor of an old converted barn, and I live in the apartment above it. The stairs creak when I climb them at night. The floors are uneven. The windows let in drafts during winter that no amount of weather stripping seems to fix. But it's mine. Every morning I wake up to the smell of old wood and linseed oil. Every evening I fall asleep to silence. I don't have much. A kitchen table I refinish myself. A bed. Books on shelves I built into the walls. A record player that belonged to my grandfather, and a collection of jazz standards I play on Sunday mornings when the quiet feels too heavy. I drink my coffee black, standing at the window that overlooks the road. I watch seasons change. I notice the way light moves across the workshop floor at different times of day. It's a small life. I know that. But small felt safe after everything that happened. Small meant I could see all the edges, all the corners. Nothing could surprise me here, except I'd been lying to myself about that. There was a box in my closet. I kept it on the top shelf, behind winter sweaters I rarely wore. A shoebox, actually nothing special about it. Inside were letters I'd written but never sent. A photograph from college, the edges soft from being held too many times. A class ring that had never been mine, that I'd kept meaning to return and then decided to keep instead, like holding on to it meant holding on to proof that any of it had been real. I didn't look in that box anymore. Hadn't opened it in years. But I knew it was there. Knew exactly where it sat in the dark, gathering dust while I pretended the past didn't matter. Most days, I convinced myself I was fine. I had my work. I had my routines. I would wake early and make coffee and spend hours carefully stripping varnish from a Victorian sideboard or repairing the broken leg of a queen and chair. The radio played low in the background, old standards that required nothing from me. Sometimes I'd go days without speaking to anyone except Mrs. Patterson when she came to pick up the dining table I'd restored for her, or Tom from the hardware store when I needed more brass fittings. I didn't use social media. Didn't see the point. Everyone performing their happiness for strangers, curating their lives into something digestible and shareable. I preferred the tangible, the real, the weight of a hand playing in my palm, the smell of fresh sawdust, the satisfaction of fitting two pieces of wood together so seamlessly you couldn't see the joint. I avoided weddings. Avoided anything that involved watching people promise forever to each other while I stood on the sidelines. It wasn't bitterness exactly, more like self-preservation. Why put myself in situations that reminded me of everything I decided to live without? But then Marcus called. Marcus, who I'd known since high school, who'd moved to the city and built himself a life full of friends and dinner parties and the kind of easy social currency I'd never quite mastered. He called on a Tuesday evening while I was cleaning brushes, and he sounded apologetic before he even asked. His friend Wesley was getting married. Someone had canceled last minute, and they needed an extra guest to balance the tables. Would I consider coming? Just for the weekend. It would mean a lot. I said no immediately. Gave him all my usual excuses. Too much work. Too far to travel. Not really my scene. But Marcus persisted. Gently. He said I'd been saying no for years. He said he missed me. He said maybe it would be good for me to be around people again, even just for a couple days. He didn't say what we both knew, which was that I'd been hiding. That my quiet life had become a kind of prison I'd built for myself, one careful decision at a time. I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear, looking out at the darkening sky, at the empty road beyond my window. And something in me, some small part I'd thought I'd buried completely, was tired. Tired of saying no. Tired of the same four walls and the same safe routines and the same deliberate smallness. So I said yes. I didn't ask who else would be there. Didn't think to ask about the groom's friends, his family, his wedding party. I packed a bag, rented a suit, and drove 3 hours to a venue I'd never heard of for a wedding full of strangers. I thought I was being brave. Thought I was finally taking a step toward something resembling a normal life. I didn't know I was walking straight toward the one person I'd spent 10 years trying to forget. I should have left. Should have walked back into that rehearsal dinner, made my excuses to Marcus, and driven home through the dark. 3 hours back to my workshop, my routines, my carefully maintained distance from anything that could hurt me. It would have been easy. It would have been the smart thing to do. But I stayed. I'm still not entirely sure why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe defiance. Maybe some part of me needed to see this through, to understand what Malcolm had become in the decade since he'd walked away from me without explanation. Or maybe it was grief, the old kind that never quite heals, just scabs over until something tears it open again. Whatever the reason, I went back inside. I found my assigned seat at dinner. I made small talk with the woman next to me about her garden and the drive up from Connecticut. I ate food I didn't taste and drank wine that did nothing to settle the adrenaline still coursing through me. And I watched Malcolm. He'd returned to the party after our encounter in the hallway, his composure fully restored. He laughed at the right moments. He raised his glass for toasts. He clapped the groom on the shoulder with easy affection. To everyone else in that room, he was exactly what he appeared to be. The best man, the loyal friend, the man who had his life together. But I saw the cracks. I saw the way his smile would falter when he thought no one was looking. The way his eyes would drift across the room and land on me, then quickly move away, like I was something dangerous he couldn't afford to acknowledge. The way he spoke just a little too fast when someone asked him a question, filling silence with words that meant nothing. I watched him down a glass of scotch in 3 swallows. Watched him excuse himself twice to step outside, returning each time with his jaw set a little tighter. Watched him avoid the corner of the room where I stood, maintaining careful distance like we were magnets with the same charge. The weekend stretched out ahead of us. A welcome brunch in the morning. A day of wedding preparations. The ceremony itself on Sunday. I could feel the weight of it, all those hours we'd have to exist in the same space, pretending we were strangers. I made it through the rehearsal dinner. Made it through the next morning's brunch, where I sat 3 tables away from Malcolm and focused on my eggs Benedict like it required my complete attention. I made it through the afternoon, wandering the grounds of the venue alone, watching other guests play lawn games and take photos in front of carefully arranged flower installations. Malcolm avoided me completely. An entire day passed where we didn't speak, didn't even make eye contact. He was good at it. Professional, even. Like he'd had practice making people disappear. I told myself I didn't care. Told myself this was better, cleaner. We'd both go home after the weekend and return to our separate lives. This would become just another strange coincidence, a story I'd never tell anyone. But that night, when I returned to my hotel room after dinner, I found a note that had been slipped under my door. It was folded once, written on hotel stationery in handwriting I still recognized. I stood there for a long moment, just looking at it on the carpet, this small white square that felt like it contained something dangerous. My hand shook slightly when I finally picked it up. The message was brief. The barn behind the chapel. Midnight. Please. No signature. No explanation. Just those 7 words, and the assumption that I would know who had written them, that I would understand what he was asking. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding that note, thinking about all the ways I could ignore it. I could stay here. I could pretend I'd never seen it. I could protect myself the way I'd learned to protect myself by refusing to let him close enough to hurt me again. But at 11:45, I found myself walking across the dark grounds toward the chapel. The barn sat behind it, separated by a meadow that had been left wild. I could see light coming from inside, soft and golden, probably from a phone or a lantern. The grass was wet with dew and soaked through my shoes. The night was quiet except for crickets and the distant sound of music from the hotel bar. Malcolm was there when I arrived. He stood near the far wall, surrounded by old farming equipment and bales of hay that smelled like summer. Wildflowers grew up through the floorboards in places where the structure had started to give way to time. It felt abandoned and beautiful, like something out of photograph. He looked up when I entered, and the relief on his face was so naked it almost made me turn around. We stood there in the dim light, not speaking. The air between us felt heavy with everything we hadn't said, everything we'd left unfinished 10 years ago. Finally, Malcolm broke the silence. His voice was rough, like he'd been holding his breath. He said he didn't know I would be here, that he couldn't do this now, that he'd changed, that everything was different. The words came out rushed, defensive, like he needed me to understand that seeing me was an accident, an intrusion into a life he'd built without me. Like he needed me to absolve him of whatever guilt he was carrying. I looked at him standing there, this man who'd once meant everything to me, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not forgiveness. Not quite. But understanding, maybe, or recognition. I said, simply, so did I. And in the silence that followed, something between us shifted. Not enough to erase the past, but enough to make space for what came next. After that night in the barn, something changed. Not dramatically, not in any way the other wedding guests would have noticed. But between us, a door had opened that neither of us seemed able to close again. We started finding each other. In corners during the pre-wedding lunch, on the terrace during cocktail hour, by the garden fountain while everyone else watched the sunset photo session. Stolen moments that felt both deliberate and accidental, like we were being pulled together by something stronger than common sense. We talked, carefully at first, staying in safe territory. He asked about my work, and I told him about furniture restoration, about bringing broken things back to life. He told me he was in corporate law now, that he worked too much, that his apartment in the city had a view he never had time to enjoy. Surface things, the kind of information you'd share with anyone. But underneath it, there was something else, a current of recognition. The way he listened when I spoke, leaning in slightly like he didn't want to miss a single word. The way I noticed details I had no business noticing, that he still bit his bottom lip when he was thinking, that he still gestured with his left hand when he was trying to explain something complicated. On Saturday afternoon, I found him on the fire escape outside the hotel's 3rd floor. He was smoking, which surprised me. He'd never smoked in college. He looked up when the door opened, and something in his expression told me he'd been hoping I'd find him there. He offered me the cigarette. I took it, even though I'd quit years ago. We stood there passing it back and forth, not speaking, looking out over the manicured lawns and distant trees. The silence felt comfortable in a way I hadn't expected, like we were remembering how to be around each other. But the past kept surfacing. It was impossible to ignore, sitting there between us like a third presence. I remembered things I tried to forget. Nights in his dorm room, the door locked, music playing low to cover the sound of our breathing. The way he used to trace the lines of my palm with his finger, like he was reading my future. Late drives with nowhere to go, just moving through darkness, his hand on my thigh, both of us pretending we had all the time in the world. I remembered how sacred it felt, how careful we were to keep it secret, not because we were ashamed, but because it was ours, something too precious and too fragile to expose to scrutiny. Or at least that's what I told myself. That's what he told me. Until the day he ended it. No warning. No explanation that made sense. He'd sat on the edge of my bed, our bed, really, since he'd spent more nights there than in his own room, and said he couldn't do this anymore. That he needed to focus on his future. That what we had wasn't sustainable. He'd used that word. Sustainable. Like we were a business model that didn't pencil out. I'd asked him if he loved me. He'd said that wasn't the point. And then he'd left, transferred to a different college for his senior year, and I'd spent months trying to understand what I'd done wrong. I never figured it out. Eventually, I stopped trying. I finished school, moved upstate, built my quiet life. I convinced myself I was over it, over him. But standing on that fire escape, watching him smoke with the same intensity he did everything, I realized I'd been lying to myself. You don't get over something like that. You just learn to live around it. That evening, during the rehearsal dinner, our eyes met across the table. It happened accidentally. Someone had made a joke, and everyone was laughing, and I glanced up at the same moment he did. Our gazes locked and held, longer than was safe, longer than we could explain away. I saw something in his face I recognized. The same one I'd felt at 21. The same impossible longing. Someone asked him a question, and the moment broke. But my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Later, in a quiet alcove near the bathrooms, we nearly collided. He caught my arm to steady me, and his hand lingered there, warm through the fabric of my shirt. We were close enough that I could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, could smell the bourbon on his breath. He said my name. Just that. Jonah, like it was a question he didn't know how to ask. I should have walked away. Should have protected myself. But I didn't. I just stood there, feeling his hand on my arm, watching something crack open in his expression. I want to hate him. Wanted to be angry for all the years he'd stolen, for the way he'd left me without explanation, for how completely he'd erased me from his life. But standing this close, seeing past the performance to the man underneath, I couldn't hold on to that anger. Because he still knew things. Still knew how I took my coffee, black, no sugar. Still knew that I crossed my arms when I was uncomfortable. Still knew the exact way to look at me that made me feel seen in a way no one else had managed in 10 years. And that terrified me more than anything. Because it meant that maybe I still knew him too. That maybe, underneath everything he'd become, there was still the person I'd loved. The person who'd loved me back, even if he'd never been brave enough to keep doing it. His hand dropped from my arm. He stepped back, said he was sorry, that he shouldn't have, and then someone called his name from the main room. He left, but the feeling of his touch stayed with me long into the night, a ghost of warmth I couldn't shake. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the old hotel settle around me, watching shadows move across the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that was about to. At 2 a.m, I gave up. I pulled on jeans and a sweater and went looking for air. The hotel had a rooftop terrace that most guests didn't know about. I'd found it by accident the day before, a door-marked staff only that wasn't actually locked. It was quiet up there, just the hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of the highway. Malcolm was already there when I arrived. He stood at the railing, looking out over the dark landscape. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his shirt sleeves. There was an empty bottle of beer on the ledge beside him. When he heard me approach, he didn't turn around, just said, quietly, that he couldn't sleep either. I moved to stand beside him, not touching, but close enough to feel the space between us like a living thing. Rain threatened. I could smell in the air, heavy and electric. But the sky held on to it, clouds moving across the moon like they couldn't decide what they wanted to be. We stood in silence for a long time. It felt like we were the only two people awake in the world. Like this moment existed outside of time, separate from the wedding waiting to happen in the morning, separate from all the years that had brought us here. Finally, I asked the question I'd been carrying for 10 years. The one that had haunted me through every quiet evening in my workshop, every time I'd looked at that box in my closet and wondered if any of it had been real. I asked him if he'd ever loved me, or if I'd just been a phase he outgrew, something he experimented with before moving on to the life he was supposed to live. My voice came out steadier than I expected, like I'd been practicing. Malcolm's hands tightened on the railing. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. that he'd deflect or make excuses or do what he'd always done, choose silence over truth. But then something in him broke. He turned to face me, and I saw tears on his cheeks, catching the dim light from the doorway. He wasn't crying loudly. It was quiet, almost restrained, but it was real in a way nothing else between us had been since I'd arrived. He said yes, said he'd love me, that he'd never stop. The words came out rough, like they'd been buried so deep he'd almost forgotten how to speak them. He told me he'd spent 10 years trying to bury what we'd had, trying to convince himself it wasn't real or wasn't worth the cost. That he'd built his entire adult life around the principle of not being the person who'd loved me. He spoke about shame, about growing up in a family where certain things weren't discussed, weren't acknowledged, weren't allowed. About the way his father had talked about men like us, with disgust poorly disguised as concern. About his mother's careful silence, the way she'd pretend not to see things that contradicted the life she'd imagined for him. He told me about trying to be someone he wasn't, about dating women in law school, forcing himself to feel things that never quite materialized, about convincing himself that what we'd had in college was just confusion, just youth, just something he could leave behind if he tried hard enough. He met Clara 3 years ago. She was kind, intelligent, easy to be with in the way things are easy when you're not risking anything fundamental. He could build a life with her that his family would celebrate, that his colleagues would understand, that fit into every expectation he'd been taught to meet. He thought he'd succeeded, thought he'd buried everything deep enough that it wouldn't matter anymore, thought he could stand at an altar and make promises he half believed were possible. And then he'd see me walk into that rehearsal dinner and realized he'd been lying to himself all along. I listened to all of it, listened to him confess everything he'd hidden, everything he'd sacrificed trying to be acceptable. And I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not pity, not quite anger either. Something more like clarity. When he finally stopped talking, when he stood there looking at me with tears still wet on his face and something desperate in his eyes, I spoke. I told him he couldn't unlive a lie by dragging someone else into it. My voice was soft but steady. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was just stating what seemed obvious to me, standing there in the dark with rain, still holding off and a wedding waiting in the morning. Clara deserved better than to be the solution to his fear. She deserved to be loved completely, not chosen because she was safe. And he deserved to stop running from who he was, even if facing it terrified him. Malcolm made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been grief. He pressed the heels of his hand against his eyes, shoulders shaking slightly. I didn't reach for him, didn't offer comfort. This wasn't something I could fix for him. This was his unraveling, long overdue. All I could do was bear witness to it. We stood there on that rooftop while the night stretched toward dawn, while Malcolm cried quietly, and I watched clouds move across the sky, and both of us faced the truth we'd been avoiding. That love, by itself, had never been the problem. It was everything else. The fear and the shame and the weight of expectations that had nothing to do with what we'd actually felt. And tomorrow, one way or another, he'd have to choose. The morning arrived too quickly. Sunlight came through my hotel window like an accusation, bright and unforgiving. I'd slept maybe an hour after leaving Malcolm on that rooftop. My eyes felt gritty. My hands shook slightly when I poured coffee from the small pot the room provided. I thought about leaving, thought about packing my bag, checking out early, making some excuse to Marcus about a work emergency. I could be home by early afternoon, back in my workshop where everything made sense and nothing hurt this much. But I didn't leave. I showered. I put on the rented suit. I tied my tie 3 times before getting it right. And at 1:45, I walked across the grounds to the chapel where Malcolm was supposed to marry someone he didn't love. The chapel was small and beautiful, all white wood and tall windows that led in streaming columns of light. Flowers lined every surface, white roses and peonies, baby's breath and eucalyptus. Everything smelled sweet and slightly overwhelming. I slipped into a seat in the back row. The chapel was nearly full, guests chatting quietly, turning to smile at each other and comment on how beautiful everything looked. A string quartet played something classical and elegant. Clara's family sat on the left side, Malcolm's on the right. His mother wore a pale blue dress and pearls. His father sat beside her with his jaw set, looking exactly like the kind of man who'd taught his son that certain things were unacceptable. My heart pounded so hard I thought the people around me might hear it. I could leave. Even now, I could stand and walk out quietly, and no one would notice. I could spare myself this. Whatever was about to happen, I didn't have to witness it. But my body wouldn't move. The music changed. Everyone stood. Clara appeared at the back of the chapel in a dress that caught the light like water. She was radiant, genuinely, heartbreakingly beautiful. She smiled at the guests as she passed, her father's arm linked through hers, completely unaware that the man waiting for her at the altar had spent the night before confessing his love for someone else. I felt sick. Malcolm stood at the front with Wesley beside him. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him perfectly. His hands were clasped in front of him. His face was composed, neutral. He looked like a man doing exactly what he was supposed to do, until Clara reached the halfway point down the aisle, until his eyes swept across the assembled guests and found mine. Time bent. Everything slowed. I watched recognition move across his face, watched something shift in his expression that I couldn't name. Our eyes locked and held. The quartet kept playing. Clara kept walking. But between us, something unspoken passed. I didn't move, didn't nod or gesture or give him any signal. I just looked at him, let him see me there, bearing witness. Let him make whatever choice he needed to make. Clara reached the altar. Her father kissed her cheek and stepped back. She turned to face Malcolm, her smile bright and trusting. She reached for his hands. The officiant began speaking. Words about love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage. Words I could barely hear over the sound of blood rushing in my ears. Malcolm held Clara's hands. He was supposed to be looking at her. This was the moment he was supposed to be focused entirely on his bride, on the future they were building together. But his eyes kept drifting to me, just for seconds at a time. Quick glances he couldn't seem to control. The officiant asked if anyone knew of any reason these two should not be wed. The traditional pause, the moment everyone expects to pass in silence. It did. No one spoke. The vows began. Clara went first, her voice steady and warm. She spoke about partnership and trust and growing old together. She talked about how Malcolm made her feel safe, how he'd become her best friend. I watched Malcolm's jaw tighten, watched his hands grip hers a little too firmly. Then it was his turn. The officiant prompted him. Malcolm opened his mouth to speak. Nothing came out. He stood there, silent, while seconds stretched into something uncomfortable. Clara's smile faltered slightly. Concerned murmurs rippled through the guests. Malcolm tried again. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. He looked at Clara, really looked at her for the first time since she'd reached the altar. And I saw the moment he understood what he was about to do to her. The moment he realized that kindness wasn't the same as love, and marrying her would be the cruelest thing he could do to them both. He stepped back, let go of her hands. He said, softly, that he was sorry, that he couldn't do this, that she deserved better than what he could give her. The chapel erupted in whispers. Clara's face went pale, then red. She said his name like a question. Malcolm shook his head, said sorry again, and then turned and walked down the aisle. Everyone watched him go. Stunned silence mixed with shocked conversation. Clara stood at the altar, frozen, her bouquet hanging at her side. Malcolm didn't look back. Not at her. Not at Wesley standing there with his mouth open. Not at his parents sitting rigid in their pew. He walked past me without stopping, out through the chapel doors into the bright afternoon. I stood. I didn't think about it. Didn't weigh my options. I just rose from my seat and followed him out into the light. We stood beneath the chapel's bell tower. Malcolm was breathing hard, like he'd been running. His hand shook as he loosened his tie. He said he couldn't do it. Not again. Couldn't stand at an altar and promise forever to someone while wishing he was somewhere else. Couldn't keep building his life around fear. I said nothing. Just stood there in the silence while the sun beat down and muffled chaos continued inside the chapel behind us. Malcolm looked at me finally. Really looked at me, without performance or pretense. I held out my hand. He stared at it for a long moment. This offer, this choice, this beginning that felt like falling. Then he took it. 6 months later, autumn arrived at the lake house like a whisper. The trees turned slowly, gold bleeding into red, leaves falling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Mornings came cold and bright. Evenings settled early, bringing that particular quality of light that only exists in October, when everything feels both ending and beginning at once. I stood at the window in what we'd started calling the workshop room, though it was really just a converted sun porch with good light and enough space for my tools. I was restoring a writing desk I'd found in an estate sale, walnut, late 19th century, with brass hardware that had oxidized to a soft green. The kind of piece that required patience. The kind that couldn't be rushed. Behind me, I heard Malcolm's footsteps on the old floorboards. He appeared in the doorway carrying 2 mugs of tea, steam rising in delicate spirals. He learned how I liked it. 3 minutes steeped, no sugar, a splash of milk. He set 1 mug on the table beside me, careful not to put it near any of the wood I was working on. These small considerations had become natural between us. The way we moved around each other in the kitchen. The way we shared space without needing to fill it with conversation. The way we'd learned, slowly, to just be. The lake house had been his idea. A place far enough from the city that we could breathe, close enough that he could still commute to the smaller law firm he joined after everything fell apart. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that needed updating, a dock that required repairs every spring. But it was ours, built on choices we'd made together, rather than lives we'd inherited. Those first weeks after the wedding had been brutal. Malcolm lost friends. His family stopped calling. The firm where he'd worked let him go quietly, citing a need to restructure. Clara's brother had confronted him in a parking lot, saying things that were probably deserved. I'd driven him home that day from the chapel, both of us silent for the entire 3 hours. When we arrived at my workshop, he'd looked at the building like he wasn't sure he had permission to enter. I told him he could stay as long as he needed. He'd stayed. We didn't rush anything, didn't fall into bed the first night, or try to recapture what we'd had in college. We were different people now. We needed to learn each other again, carefully, like you'd learn a language you once spoke but had forgotten. Some nights he'd sleep on the couch. Some nights I'd find him crying in the bathroom at 2 in the morning, overwhelmed by everything he'd lost and everything he'd chosen. I'd sit with him on the tile floor, not offering solutions, just presence. Slowly, something grew between us. Not the urgent, secret love we'd had at 21. Something quieter, more deliberate, built on honesty instead of hiding. A letter sat on the windowsill now, catching afternoon light. It had arrived 3 weeks ago, forwarded through Malcolm's old address. Clara's handwriting on the envelope. We'd both stared at it for a day before Malcolm finally opened it. Inside was a single page. She wrote that she'd been angry, that she'd cried for weeks, that her family had wanted her to hate him and part of her had tried. But she also wrote that she understood, that maybe in some quiet part of herself, she'd always known he was holding something back, that she deserved to be chosen completely, and so did he, that she hoped he'd found what he was looking for. She signed it simply. Clara, no blessing, no viternis. Just her name and the space to move forward. Malcolm had cried when he read it, but it was different this time. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. The permission to forgive himself, offered by the person he'd hurt most. Now I watched him settle into the chair by the window with his own tea, opening his laptop to work on a case brief. Afternoon sun caught in his hair, showing threads of gray that hadn't been there 6 months ago. We'd both aged in this time, not from years, but from growth, from the work of becoming people who could live honestly. I turned back to the writing desk, ran my hand along the wood grain, feeling for imperfections. Malcolm's presence behind me was comfortable, steady, not the desperate certainty of first love, but something more sustainable, something built to last. Later, after dinner, I brought down the box from my closet, the one I'd kept hidden for 10 years, the one I'd almost thrown away a dozen times, but never could. I set it on the table between us without ceremony. Malcolm looked at it, then at me. He knew what it was. I told him about it weeks ago, during one of our late-night conversations when we were learning to be honest about everything, even the painful parts. He reached out slowly, lifted the lid. Inside were the letters I'd written but never sent. The photograph of us from college, young and unafraid in a way we'd never be again. The class ring he'd given me one night and asked for back the next morning, when fear had caught up with him. He picked up the ring, turned it over in his fingers. His graduation year etched inside the band. I kept it all this time, kept the evidence of what we'd been, even when I tried to forget. Malcolm looked at me with something like wonder, like he couldn't believe I'd held onto these pieces of him through all the years of silence. I said we didn't have to keep any of it, that maybe it was time to let the past be past. But he shook his head, said maybe we should keep it, not as a shrine to who we'd been, but as a reminder of what it cost to get here, of what we'd both survived to find each other again. So we went through the box together, read the letters aloud, looked at the photograph, and laughed at our younger selves, held the ring up to the light. And when we were finished, we put everything back inside. Not hidden this time, just stored, part of our history, part of the story we were still writing.